The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for logging in on time/early for those of you who've been here for a few minutes. We are going to go ahead and wait just a few more minutes. We have several dozen people registered, and right now about a dozen are here. So we're just going to probably start off at about 2:05, just to make sure that everybody who's coming from other meetings and phone calls has a chance to do that. And make sure that we're not leaving anybody by the wayside. I see more people logging in every second. So just stay tuned and we'll get started in just a minute. While we're waiting, if you could go ahead for all of you who want to type in chat, if you have any questions related to data or data management that you'd like to make sure we cover today on a future webinar, or even right now, if we can answer it in a couple of minutes, I'm sure Jeff would love to take all of those questions. So feel free to type that into chat, or if you think of it during the presentation, feel free to type it in, and I'll make sure it gets answered for you. So again, just a few more minutes to make sure everybody can join in. We'll be starting promptly in at 2:05. Well, a lot more people are logging in every second. So for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to be starting in about 2 or 3 minutes to make sure that everybody is able to get all of the content. We don't want to miss anybody out. For anybody who has, ending meetings at 2 o'clock and trying to log in. So if you have any questions that you'd like Jeff to answer before we get started, please feel free to type them into chat. Also, would anybody just mind typing in hi just to make sure you can all hear me?
Sound check.
What is the agenda for this session? So this is going to be the first of a 3-part series. Jeff, would you like to highlight what we're going to be going over starting in about 1.5 minutes?
Sure, I even have a slide on it. We have 2 basic topics. The first one is the difference between high availability and disaster recovery and backup, and why there's often communication issues, because sometimes what management says is not what the data or IT team hear, and vice versa. So we'll be talking about what those mean, what the communication issues are. We'll highlight some mistakes that people have made and how to avoid them. Second topic is cloud versus on-prem and why people are moving in either direction today.
Awesome.
Excuse me.
And Jeff, even if you don't have a slide on it, do you want to give them sort of a sneak peek as to what we're going to cover in the next session?
No, because I don't have a slide on
it. All right, they'll have to get an email.
That's my marketing team.
No problem. Okay, we are getting close to 2:05. We'll be starting in just a second here. Anybody with questions about data management, databases, SQL, feel free to type them into chat at any time during the presentation. We will make sure we answer all your questions. If your question is somehow too involved to answer here, we'll make sure we schedule some time for you and Jeff to hash it out and get your question answered at another date.
And just to clarify one thing while we're on those, Devin, I will not be watching the chat while I'm talking, but you're invited to interrupt me with questions if one of them is pertinent and relevant.
Exactly. So I'm going to follow up with Sanji real quick before I kick us off. Will we be covering best practices for migrating on-prem database environments to the cloud? Good question, Jeff.
Short answer is no, but that sounds like a good basis for another presentation. What we're going to be discussing here are not so much the technical issues as the business issues. So we'll be talking about why you go to the cloud, why you wouldn't go to the cloud. We'll be spending some times on reasons that migration in either direction has failed. We'll talk about cost effectiveness of one over the other, real effects on the business, things of that nature. So we might have one on those in our technical library, Devin, if you want to send that over.
At the very least, I know we have blogs on the subject. So Sanjeev, if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that subject, please feel free to reach out to us after the today's webinar via email at devin@soaringeagle.guru. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Thanks, everybody, for coming out here today. My name is Devin. My name is not Wesley. That's my son's name. And I am the National Account Manager here at Soaring Eagle Consulting. And for those of you who don't know what we do here, we make sure that your data is maintained, accessible, and performing well 24/7. Jeff and his team are all onshore, all expert to guru level. I believe our DBAs average about 15 to 20 years of experience, and a lot of them, including the leadership team, have 25, 30 years plus. So a little bit about our speaker. He is our CEO. He has written 20 books on database management over his 30-year career and founded Soaring Eagle Consulting about 20 years ago. Jeff, would you like to add anything else at this moment?
I think that's a good start.
Excellent. So some of you may have noticed that we are doing some pretty cool giveaways during this webinar series. This is going to be the first part of a 3-part webinar series. And if you attend all 3 parts, you will be entered into a raffle to win a 4-night stay at an amazing cabin in Blue Ridge, Georgia. So please stick around, make sure you come to all 3 sessions so that we can give that away. Also, during these sessions, I have been given permission by Jeff to give away Amazon gift cards. And because I am in charge, I'm going to give them away whenever I want to anyone in the chat who asks a good question, who sticks around for the entire thing. And as a matter of fact, our first one is going to go to Jean-Pierre. Make sure you stick around afterwards so I can get your information. You were the first person to log in today, so you're going to be the first person to get a gift card. So we'll automatically enter you in for the 4-night stay for everybody who is attending all 3 of the sessions, which are going to be the last Thursday of every month for the first quarter. And the goal with these sessions is really so that C-levels and managers can get a firm idea of the things they need to be thinking about and articulating to their teams so that they can make sure they're off to a strong start in 2021. So with that said, Jeff, would you like to take us away and get started?
I will do. Thank you, Devin. And once again, feel free to interrupt if a chat comment is relevant to what I'm talking about. And I'm just going to dive in and start talking. So we've already spoken a little bit about the agenda. I'm just going to dive right in and start talking about some definitions. So one of the things that we find, we as Soaring Eagle deal with a lot of different customers on a day-to-day basis. And over the course of a year, probably are touching over 100 different companies worth of systems. So there are a lot of commonalities that we see in terms of ideas, in terms of desires. And I want to talk about terminology for a couple of minutes before talking about how to implement or what some of the best practices are. So the first topic is high availability. And the idea behind high availability is that your system is unlikely to become inaccessible for any reason. So when you have a site in upstate New York and an ice storm hits and your power goes, does your customer in Chicago get affected? Well, if you have a high availability failover, then hopefully the answer to that is no. Now, the next topic is disaster recovery, or the next term is disaster recovery. And the idea behind disaster recovery is if something happens to the physical site where everything you got resides, do you have the ability to get up and running? So that's more than an ice storm. That is everything in the room that you had melted. That means that your co-location vendor went out of business and the power is down and you can't get to your hardware. That is, you have had a ransomware attack and everything on your current network is absolutely inaccessible because it has been encrypted. Can we do a bare metal restore to a fresh environment in another location, which is hopefully air-gapped from that environment? The next topic is a backup, and note that high availability and DR are separate topics from a backup because they have different purposes. The idea behind a backup is that you're able to do a restore. So the backup is a component of the disaster recovery that you're using, but the backup also does things like help you out if, for example, somebody maliciously or accidentally drops a table in production. Where do you get that data back from? Because if you drop that table, your high availability system will automatically drop it on the remote site. And when you do your DR, well, that is a lot of work to do simply to get you to the point where you bring a little information back or a lot of information back. The backup also helps you if you had some sort of a data corruption, and that does happen. It's infrequent, but if you have a corruption which is caused by a server bug, which used to be the most frequent cause, or due to a hardware issue, which is currently the most frequent cause simply because the software is very good, they're both very infrequent, we have the ability to bring that back up. Now, Rpo and Rto have to do with that high availability and disaster recovery because you ask questions like the following. How long can I afford to be down? How long until a failover can happen? How long can we wait in case we have an absolute disaster, lightning strikes our IT center, the barriers that we have between the power and the hardware failed and we need to start things up again? The recovery point objective asks the question, how much data can we afford to lose? So if, for example, you get hit by a ransomware attack at 3 p.m., can you deal with losing, say, a minute's worth of information if you can only restore to 2:59 p.m.? The RTO has to do with how fast can you recover? So your recovery time objective answers the question, how long can our users afford to wait? And this is extremely industry and company specific. So when we're talking to a house that does stock trading, 20 years ago, and this was a long time ago from a real life perspective, I had a client who told me very specifically that they had measured the cost of being down, and every 1 minute of downtime equated to a $1 million loss of revenue. In an environment like that, the RTO is going to be very low and their spend on high availability is going to be high because the cost of the insurance is negligible compared to the cost of the loss. Flip side is I do have clients even to this day that say, you know what, if I lose a day's worth of data, it's no big deal. I'll have everybody re-enter it. Now, that's kind of a day's worth of lost time, but if somebody wants to make that decision, that's their business decision and not a technical decision.
Hey, Jeff, we've already got some good questions in the chat. If you don't mind pausing here real quick.
Not at all.
The first one comes from Nadir. I hope I'm saying your names correctly, guys. I apologize if I'm not. The first question is, can high availability be used to minimize downtime for patching and software upgrades?
Oh, that's actually a long question. So it's not going to, it's going to help with some of it. So with some systems, you can turn high availability off, patch the secondary, catch it up, fail over to the secondary, patch the primary, and fail back. That is feasible. It is something that our clients do, or we will do on behalf of our clients. So yes, that is possible and often feasible. What was the second part of that question, Devin?
I think you covered it all. Patching efforts and software upgrades.
In that case, yes. Keep in mind that software upgrades would be the DBMS software upgrades and not things like stored procedure upgrades. This presentation is a little bit SQL Server centric, but these things do carry over to most sophisticated DBMSs. What's the next question?
I would like to know about your recommendation for backup plans. Oh, sorry, we got more as I was talking. Specifically for how many times per period. So is it per 1 million transactions, per month? How do you know how often you need to back up, I believe is the short version of that question.
Great. So that's a good question. So the idea behind a backup is not how often you need to perform a full database backup. There's several types of backups, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we can do a full backup and we can do an incremental backup. So if I do a full backup at midnight, which includes absolutely everything in the database, I may choose at lunchtime to do another backup, which just includes changes to the database since that full backup was done at midnight. Those tend to be much smaller. The incremental backups, also called log backups, and several of the DBMSs that we work with do exactly that. So it's not so much how many transactions have you performed as going back to the RPO, what is your recovery point objective? So you as a business owner, or if you're a technical person, you will go to your CTO or CIO and ask the question, how much data can we afford to lose? And they always say we can't afford to lose any data. Then you give them the cost of setting that up, and then they sort of back down from that particular position and say, maybe we can afford to lose a couple minutes worth and just let people know to double check what they've put in there. So if, for example, you have a full backup at midnight and then a transaction log or incremental backup at noon, your likely data loss is somewhere in the middle there. So you have a likely 6-hour loss of that 12 hours data, and you can draw that line there. So most shops that we work with cannot afford to have a 12-hour loss or a 6-hour loss. So they'll take those incremental backups more frequently. The idea behind the backup is to be able to do that restore, and the frequency of backup is directly related to that recovery point objective. Did I answer your whole question? Hopefully.
I think so, but of course it's spawning more. So let's hit a couple more of these and then circle back to some of these questions a little bit later. Let's try to save the specific technical questions maybe for the end and stick to some of the more general ones during. So real quick, as a general rule, what's the importance of testing your disaster recovery plan?
Well, you don't have a disaster recovery plan if it hasn't been tested, and that is my firm opinion, and you can hold me to that one. I think that answers your question.
I was going to say the same thing, actually. So best advice to measure RPO and RTO, and then we'll get back to the presentation.
Measuring them, the only way to measure it is to test it. As far as what they should be, that is a business decision and not a technical decision, and that is something to negotiate with either the line of business owner responsible for the data or with the CIO or CTO, depending on the roles in the company.
Great. Let's go ahead and move forward.
Thank you, Devin. So we've actually touched upon several of the different things that we can do in order to maintain the data safety. Coming back into definitions again, we've talked about backups. We've got a lot of different types of backups. We talked about full, we've talked about incremental. One of the other things we have to talk about is that we need to make sure that we move those backups to, and I will use a very broad term, someplace else. So a lot of times people will perform the backups, they'll have these things automated, those backups will go to a drive on the same box or to the same SAN that everything else is running on, and guess what happens when the SAN crashes? You've lost your backups. So we try to make sure that when we have a backup, there is a backup which is separate from where we are, and also air-gapped. What do I mean by air-gapped? I mean that you have to be off of the same network, preferably someplace where you have to actually pick a copy of something up and move it over, or where that hard connection is removed. The reason for that is if you have that ransomware attack and the ransomware is encrypting everything on the network, We want to make sure we're not on that network, or at least that we have a backup that's not on that network. We have the ability to do log shipping. Log shipping is a very old approach to taking those incremental backups and putting them to another site. There are better ways of doing that today. We also have the ability to do availability groups. Availability groups is the Microsoft SQL Server terminology for let us set things up so that if the primary fails, the secondary picks it up, and we can set this up to happen automatically. A few different modes for availability groups. The first is synchronous. Synchronous means that we're committing on both sides at the same time. Those are usually geographically close because you don't want to commit across, oh, well, we have our primary in California and our secondary in New York, and we've got, maybe 120 milliseconds round trip time. We don't want every transaction waiting 120 milliseconds to commit. So something like that would likely be asynchronous. But you need to be synchronous if you want the automatic failover. We also have the ability to scale the reads. What does that mean? Let's say, for example, I have a very high volume website. That very high volume website is being used all over the country or all over the world. Well, if you have a very heavy read rate in the US and in China and in New Zealand and in pick your location, what you might want to do is have copies of the data which are local to those geographic areas, at least the ones where you're performing the reads. So with the availability groups, you can create scalable reads by moving the databases, copies of the databases, synchronized copies of the data out to these remote sites. Then when it comes time to access the data, what you'll do is you'll ask the question, which of the components of the availability group can answer the fastest? Usually that's the one that's geographically closest. You can pick that up. Then when it comes time to do the writes, you can push those off to your transactional system. A lot of very cool things you can do with availability groups. The final one we have listed here is replication. Replication is very different from any of these because replication is transaction specific. So what that means is I can have a full database. Maybe I've got a multi-terabyte database sitting on my primary, and I've got this location off in a corner someplace that I want to have a subset of the data. With replication, I can choose to have that subset of data moved over there. Or flip side, maybe I have a central location, maybe I am in New York or I'm in Tampa, and I have locations where I'm taking transactional information all over the world. Well, what I can do with the replication is have the replication automatically push the changes from the local to the central and go in that direction. We can also have bidirectional replication, which is a little bit more difficult to set up. So, as we start talking about the individual components, things about the backups. Backups should be automated. A lot of companies now are using tools for the backups. This is fine. There are a lot of backup tools right now that are DBMS aware and that do appropriate and beautiful backups. As I mentioned for the DR though, they have to be tested. I have seen situations where companies spent an enormous amount of money, 6-7 figures on a backup solution, didn't test it. Over the course of a year, found out the hard way that none of the backups were working because they had a corrupt database and could not restore from their backup. That was a large insurance company that had to furlough 90% of their employees for a few weeks before they found us. We got it fixed and restored. Next, there are multiple types of backups to use and multiple ways of identifying changes on your system. Within SQL Server, we have the ability to have multiple recovery models. We've got full recovery and simple recovery. We do not generally ever want to have a simple recovery model in production because simple makes it impossible to do those incremental backups. What that means is you can only have full backups. Local backups are fast. Directly to remote storage can be slow. What most shops will do is a local backup and then have a remote process sweep things from the local storage to the remote site. That way the backup is still happening quickly and you still get things moving off to the remote site. We have had clients in the past that have said, well, I don't need to have a backup. I've got RAID storage. Well, the RAID is fast and it's redundant, but the backup is not only protecting against a storage failure, backup is also protecting against human error, and it's protecting against malice. Why use backups? Data is safe, gives us the ability to make copies where we want to, gives us the ability to do a lot of great testing. It is great for insurance, data availability, gives us the ability to recover to a point in time, or gives us the ability to recover in case of logic error, user error, or again, malice. Caution.
So Jeff,
Go ahead.
first, we have a question that I think would be appropriate to answer, and that is, what's the best way to test your backups?
To restore it. There is no other way to test a backup. After restore it, make sure that the restore is good. Sometimes people will restore it and run a query and say, yep, it seems to be up, but you also want to use a tool to make sure that the entire database came up. On SQL Server, that is a Dbcc, database consistency checker. That should be done before you age your backups out, as well as after the restore. That was the second caution listed here. Make sure the backups are clear of corruption. Run the Dbcc. If not before every backup, at least before you age out your backups.
Great answer, thank you. I think it's also a good time to wake up everybody with a shot at our gift card. I'm going to do a trivia question on this one, and it's going to be a really hard trivia question here. What is my son's name? Spelling counts. The first person to write it in will get the gift card. Anyone have an answer? Jeff Jr. No. Okay. What's my son's name?
Hint: it was behind Devin's head on the wall.
All right, we got someone who figured it out.
Okay.
Excellent. All right, the first person to have typed that in will be our winner, and we'll get a gift card. So I'll message you in a minute, and we'll make sure we get that squared away. Jeff, back to you.
Sure. Moving on, log shipping. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. We do have clients that are using it. I'm not sure why they are, except that that's the way they've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, and it's worked so good so far. The idea behind log shipping is that we take the full database backup, we restore that on a remote server, then we take all of the subsequent incremental backups, ship them over to and the incremental backup is that log. So we ship that log over to the remote site and do a load, and that remote backup is always in the process of the restore. The one advantage that you get out of log shipping is that when you're applying the logs, you can restore a log to a point in time. So with high availability, what happens is you've got somebody in there. I was at a site not too long ago where a junior DBA dropped a table in production instead of dropping the table in test. That junior DBA was reprimanded, and then the junior DBA did that again a week later, and at that point, that junior DBA was let go. Now, if you need to protect against that type of thing, advantage in log shipping is that the log shipping can restore to a point in time. So if we know that table was dropped at 258, we can restore to 257 in 59 seconds on the target. And if you've got log shipping going, all you need to do is take the most recent log, dump it, and perform the restore. It is an unusual type of thing to have to restore from, but it is a good reason to go with a log shipping solution. Most shops today are more into high availability solutions. High availability, as we discussed earlier, gives us a lot of options, from synchronous updates, meaning we keep identical copies of the data on both sides of the availability group, to asynchronous. Asynchronous is generally used over larger geographic distances. We have a guy in our team today that I hired several years ago, and I hired him after 1 minute in an interview, and that was because I found out that he had architected, designed, implemented, and been responsible for an availability group that was set up across 3 continents. If you can set that up and keep it tuned and up and highly available, you're smart. I hired him as soon as I heard that. That was the end of the technical interview. It was that good, and I have not been sorry for bringing that person on. When you're building these availability groups, there's a lot of decisions to make, and it's basically based on the business requirements. We've got the ability to do automatic failover. We've got the ability to keep multiple copies for read scaling. We've got immediate failover, and by immediate, there's often a couple of seconds where the server is figuring out that the failover happened and we're going to the target. Other than that, it works pretty solidly. And we've got a lot of customers using it for that purpose. That synchronous failover are for those shops that simply can't afford to go down. They're a little bit to configure and maintain. You have a little bit of overhead with those synchronous writes, so you want to make sure that the synchronicity is close geographically, and by close geographically, I generally mean in the same data center, if not in the same rack. Here is a sample config for an availability group. What this one is doing is describing a primary database. And note that the availability groups are by database, they are not by server. So I could have a primary server with a primary DB. I could have a primary server, a second primary server with a primary DB, and I could cross those in such a way that if one failed, the other was taking up the entire load. Anyway, the primary has a synchronous secondary. I'm going to automatically fail over to that synchronous secondary. I also have asynchronous secondaries, which are used primarily for reads, but if I wanted to, I could manually fail over to any of those asynchronous secondaries by pausing the primary and initiating the failover. A lot of cool things you can do with availability groups. Replication is basically distributed processing. So we have the ability to do this. Now on SQL Server, I will describe the replication as less solid than most of the other technology that you have in SQL Server. There's not been a lot of update to it since it was written 30 odd years ago. And that's pretty much it. When I walk into a shop that has problems, anytime they mention replication, I ask, is that one of the sources of your problem? And it's almost always a yes. The reason for that is that the replication is very finicky. If one small thing goes wrong, you may have to go back and restart it and make sure everything is once again synchronized. But the ability to do that bi-directional replication, especially across areas where you've got a lot of geographic distance and or areas where things like internet are not stable. Maybe you've got an application on a small island someplace and the internet moving back to the mainland is intermittent, or it's via satellite, which sometimes is just not available because of clouds or whatever, or via some sort of line that goes underwater where the bandwidth is challenged. There's some good reasons to use replication. However, it tends to be my second choice for most types of application. So some common mistakes that we see. Note that mirrors, by the way, are being deprecated in favor of high availability and availability groups. That's why I don't talk about mirrors separately. They're going away. The reason that they don't replace backups is that if you have a data problem, it's going to get replicated out to the high availability. Corruption may be copied over to the secondary. Malevolence absolutely moves over to the secondary. Make sure that you periodically test your restores. If you have not tested your restore, just like the DR, you are not necessarily going to be able to restore. I have had many experiences with prospects, not existing clients, because we make them all do a test of their restores, but I've had multiple experience with prospects where they tried to do a restore under stress and the restore failed because they'd never tested it. My favorite recommendation is that you not only test your restores, but make your most junior DBA do the restores. Reason of that is multifold. First, if the procedure is so complex that it's not working for the junior DBA, you need better documentation. Second, it gets you a test of the restore. Third, it gives you a test of the documentation. Fourth, it gives your junior DBA the practice of doing the restore and bringing it back online and remembering all the appropriate steps. Make sure also that when you test your restore, you're running Dbcc or your DBMS's equivalent. Otherwise, you don't know that the restore is good. You also need to test your failovers periodically. How often do we test the failovers? That's a comfort level. It is often mandated by a compliance officer, often mandated by a CTO. I have clients that do that as often as monthly, and some that do it as infrequently as quarterly or semi-annually. I think semi-annually is the least frequently that I see tested failovers, although I'm sure there's somebody out there who does these things annually. Also, make sure you test your bare metal restore. Whereas you may feel like you're never going to have to do it, knowing what all the components are can be critical to identifying that you missed something in your DR plan, and as a result, very highly recommended. Everything from installing the operating system to making sure all the patches are applied, you name it, identify it, put it in a spreadsheet, add up all the times, and make sure that your RPO and RTO aren't getting crushed. Finally, make sure that you have an air gap. For, oh gosh, most of 2018 and a lot of 2019, every single CIO, CTO, CEO summit that I went to had a lot of people talking about ransomware, how to deal with it. Let me give you a short summary of probably 100 hours of lecture. First, it's going to happen. Assume it's going to happen. You've got a great firewall, but in all of the red versus blue, all of the simulations, the attacking group almost always gets in. Almost always. How much do they get? That varies. But what we find is that if you're the C-level exec and you go to the board and say, we got hit, what you need to do is have a plan ready that they have already approved, so that you tell them, you know what, we may get hit. This is what we're going to do if we get hit. Please approve it now. That way I don't have to come to you and call a special board meeting when somebody sneaks in, or a new employee opens the door, or somebody does something stupid, or somebody clicks on an email and that email has the virus which locks everything up. And all of these things happen in real life. So when the attack hits, your options are pretty limited. Option one, pay the ransom. I have always been against paying the ransom because A, I don't like paying people to do things like that. Secondarily, I don't know that I'm not going to have to pay it again. You can hire a company that does the decryption for you. They will likely take previous ransom keys, try to apply them. They may try to back things out. These companies have moderate effects. Do always call the FBI. Tell them you've been hit. They have a website to go directly to. In real life, unless you're a giant company, you're going to go into a queue and you may not hear back from them. However, you do want this thing registered. They will call you back. They will ask you what's happened, what the status is, where you are, and over the course of time, they will try to track down the perpetrators. What I strongly recommend is that as soon as you know you've been hit with the ransomware, do what you can to isolate those networks. Begin the process of a bare metal restore immediately from that air-gapped backup. Now, if somebody decides they're going to pay the ransom, that may or may not be your decision. However, you are already in the process of getting things rolling. The important thing here is to make sure that you have a plan for when this hits, that you have the ability to get your backup restored from someplace which is not on that network. If you do, you're a hero. If you don't, you're the opposite. And they will point fingers and they will ask why you didn't think of that one ahead of time. So that is a 2-minute summary on hundreds of hours worth of lecture. Summary on high availability. Backups are mandatory.
Real quick, Jeff, a good question came in. Do you recommend using companies that do penetration tests?
Absolutely. We here at Soaring Eagle do that on at least an annual basis, and I think we're up to semi-annual. It's part of our SOC compliance. The penetration test, and make sure you're not using Joe's penetration test company. I always worry that those people are also doing other things that I don't have to worry about. I want somebody that I can sue later if something weird happens and I get attacked immediately after the penetration attack happens. So the nice thing about the penetration attack is they will look for areas of weakness that you might not have seen. When I am teaching database administration and talking about restore plans and failure plans, what I always tell people to do is find the practical joker in their group and ask them, if you were going to break this process someplace, how would you do it? Now, I will admit to being a practical joker outside of the office environment, and I never do it in a professional environment, but my brain sometimes looks at things and says, you know, this would be easy to twist, and that's something that penetration test company will do, because they have a list of all the basic ways that a ransomware attacker will try to get in, and they will send your employees free gifts and via email, and they will send them attempt to come in through your firewall and around your firewall, and make sure that you don't have the basic passwords that haven't changed in years and all the rest of that happy stuff. Yes, I absolutely recommend pen tests, 100%. Summary, you must have backups. Those backups should be air-gapped. If you don't, you are at risk. Log shipping has a very specific solution. I can't remember ever recommending it, but I have been in situations where people were able to justify it to me in such a way that I didn't recommend getting rid of it. Mirrored databases are to be deprecated. Availability groups, sophisticated, they work, they're stable, they're solid, they've been around for several releases. Highly recommend availability groups for high availability, and not to replace backups, not to replace SANs, not to replace RAID, but to make sure that you have copies of data wherever you need them. Replication, special purpose tool. A lot of these get combined when somebody says, if I'm down for a minute, it's going to cost me $1 million. You can combine these in such a way that your chances of going down are very negligible, and if you do, you probably have about the same odds as winning that lottery ticket. If anybody on here has won the $1 billion, congratulations to you. So we have talked about the data component of a DR plan here, and by the way, this presentation will be available for sharing, and it will also be available for distribution. Here is a partial list of the things that need to be in a DR plan, and this is above and beyond just the things I've talked about. Things like make sure the DR guide is in your run book and that it has been tested. Make sure you know who does what, when, in what order, what the approximate times are. I'm not going to read these all to you, but be aware that I am a very data-centric type of person. This is a very data-centric presentation, and that there are more components to testing your restore than just the data. And here's a partial list. Once again, until you've tested it, you don't know for sure that you've got all of the individual components. Devin, any more questions at this time before I change topics?
Let me go see real quick. I'm gonna allow Sanjeev has a slew of questions. I asked him to keep note of them and ask them after we finish the full presentation. I do want to answer all of them just after we get through the main presentation first.
Okay.
Otherwise, go ahead.
And if we need extra time, then yeah, we can do a separate call. Very happy to do that.
Absolutely. Please continue asking those questions. I'm just going to try and keep us moving a little bit on anything that I think is specifically technical instead of more meta and C-level geared. All right?
Yeah, and I only have about another 10 or 12 minutes to talk about cloud versus on-prem, but that's probably enough. So I'm going to summarize the entire next 10 minutes of talk with the following sentence. I don't know any organization that went from on-prem to the cloud and said, oh my goodness, I've just saved an enormous amount of money off my budget. Never happened that I've seen. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it would be extremely unusual. The goal of cloud computing is not to reduce your budget, and if you have anything up in the cloud, you'll see that it is not a cheap solution. However, it is a complete solution. It has got failover built in, and what it does is it alleviates the need for you to have a SAN group, a networking group, a hardware group, you fill it in and have 24/7 availability of a lot of different technical staff, but instead allows you to focus on the actual business of your business rather than the business of running an operational center. This does not mean necessarily that it is right for you. It just simply means that you're not worrying about it. The cloud computing itself isn't even necessarily something that is permanently available. I have one client that is, I will say, excessively paranoid. They have 1,600 servers. They decided they want to get out of the hardware business, so they're going to put it all up on Azure, but they're worried that at some point Microsoft may go out of business, so they're going to use availability groups to keep copies of it over on AWS. They figure the chances of Amazon and Microsoft both going out of business are slim, but that's how they're able to sleep at night. Now, to me, that is an impressive degree of paranoia, and I applaud the effort, but I suspect it is working a little bit too hard for most intents and purposes. So the arguments for going to the cloud: your operations is done. This is all handled behind the scenes. You don't care. It is scalable. That means if you need more resources, they're generally available on demand, as opposed to going after acquiring more hardware or you name it. Beware, though, that scalability is also a trap, because if you need twice the CPU and you buy twice the CPU, you may have solved the problem for the short term, but you really need to figure out why you suddenly needed twice the CPU. Not everybody has the time or makes the time. This is designed for remote work, and over the course of this last year, I think everybody in the world is suddenly aware that remote work becomes important. We say goodbye to depreciation. We say goodbye to having to migrate from one physical server to another. We say goodbye to having to, every 3 or 4 years, get rid of old hardware and figure out where it's going. We get the easy ability to disperse geographically. Well, I've got a primary site down here in the Southeast, and I have a secondary site out in the Midwest, and I handle that. How do I know I've handled it? Well, I can check ping times, but my contract says I've got it handled. I do recommend testing that anyway. Frees up time and resources of a lot of your staff. Now they get to focus on growing the business instead of managing the hardware. Costs become predictable. Note that costs are not immediately predictable. There are a lot of tools available to identify and figure out what the costs are likely to be. They don't work out always as well as you expect. Note that your pricing changes at whim. There's a line from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that says every time somebody gets the universe figured out, it vanishes in a puff of dust and a crazier one appears. That is my opinion about pricing for most of the cloud types of things. It is based on whim. So, how expensive is it? You're going to find out. Case study moving to the cloud. I've only got a few minutes left. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the individual case studies. Short version is moving from bare metal to cloud works out really well for a lot of groups. This allows them to scale if you're having a hard time finding folks, if you're in the middle of New York City and the network admins that you're trying to hire all want $200,000 a year. this could be a really easy decision for you to make. Also gives you the ability to scale for the short term. So if, for example, you know on Black Friday you're going to need 10 times the computing power that you needed the day before, you can do that with the cloud and get that, and then reduce the loads. Very cool stuff. So the cloud migration can be a simple process. One of the questions earlier was, do we have recommendations for best practices? We do, and that is simply another separate lecture. The load testing can be streamlined because we can put the loads on separate environments which are designed differently. And the cloud has a lot of scalability. In this particular case, that client was really happy with the scale. We also have the ability to, using the cloud, to scale certain components. So I do have a customer that is using the stretch component of SQL Server to take the older material, that is to say, the stuff that is no longer used but needs to be kept for legal or regulatory purposes, putting that stuff up on the cloud and keeping it logically in the same database. There's some very cool stuff that can work along those lines. So when you're doing this, make sure that your internal people see the vision. A lot of people, when you start going to the cloud, start worrying about their jobs. Let them know where they're going to be in advance. You want people cooperating with the migration. You do not want them feeling stressed or threatened by it. Don't rush it. Make sure that you have got all the pieces in place, that you have tested the migration, you know how long it's going to take, you know how long things are going to be down if in fact they're down. One of the things you can do, for example, is use availability groups to move to the cloud. That is a very fast way of getting there when your availability group is a target and you perform a failover to the cloud. Arguments against the cloud. Costs seem always to be higher. One of the places the costs tend to be higher is that when you put your load tool on, the load will say this load is going to cost X dollars in the cloud, but it doesn't always say, okay, the cloud comes unsecured, and as you start adding firewalls, as you start adding alerts, as you start adding fill in the blank, those things start to add up. You don't have control of the environment. You don't know where the physical servers are going to be. You don't even necessarily know where the individual components are going to be from day to day. You may end up with very fast disk today and then slower disk, which was what you originally paid for, tomorrow. You have the risk of security. A lot of people won't go to the cloud because they feel that the cloud vendors have the security or are not as secure as they are. Note that a lot of highly secure things are out on the cloud today. Cloud requires an internet connection. If your internet connection goes down, you can't get to the cloud. On the other hand, if your internet connection goes down, your clients can't get to you, and you have to decide what's important. Those are most of them. Availability, connection speed. Make sure that you're aware that cloud does not guarantee high availability. That is one of the things that you will pay for separately. Note that about a third of companies opted to make the transition away from the cloud in 2017. This is the last date for which we have numbers. That is because the cloud failed to meet their expectations. I do have a lot of customers that said, well, we tried it and we're keeping a little bit up there because we kind of keep our toes in, but we're not ready for it. A lot of groups went to the cloud. I have a new client that is relatively small in size. They're about a $20 million a year customer. Sorry, not $20 million to us. They make about $20 million a year. And they have about $100,000 a month in spend up on AWS. Well, that's a lot. And you've got to ask yourself, for $1 million, could I have put together that operational center and run it and manned it locally? Now, that's as a percentage of business, and we haven't addressed, is that the wisest way of using the resources and all the rest of the happy stuff? But you still end up in situations where you do have to ask a variety of different questions. Make sure that your estimates are good, that you are using the routes of data, that the manipulation of massive data on the cloud is not costing you a fortune. and we look at it. So as with everything else, test, check your requirements, and don't expect miracles. So I've used up my hour. I've got about 6 minutes left. I will entertain questions. I will turn this back over to Devin for questions and or to give stuff away.
Alrighty, let's start with Diane. Diane is asking, what about DRP with migrating to the cloud?
That's a very broad question, Diane. Can you ask a more specific one?
Okay, while we are getting that response, let's go with Sanjeev.
Sounds like he has a lot of fun questions.
He does. Do you want to open it up and take a couple of them?
I tried opening up the chat, and I'm not getting the audience chat here. I don't have an explanation as to
it's
why.
under questions.
Oh, and I'm looking at chat. Thank you. There are a lot of these. So, agenda we've got.
They're all very good questions.
Testing your DR. What is the best advice to measure how well you're meeting? Okay, we've talked. Thanks. Best way to test a backup or do it. If simple recovery model is not recommended, why does SQL Server offer this feature? For the same reason that they automatically associate clustered indexes to keys. It is simply that if they offer that feature, they don't have to worry about people who aren't aware of how to do incremental backups and logs that grow forever. But simple recovery model may be a good model in your development and test environments where you're not doing those full backups. My statement about not using simple was in production environments. Can we restore backup on a different SQL server? Absolutely. Wesley, that's for you. Jeff Jr. was not correct. Restoring back left, can you apply some sort of policies that present a junior DBA to, see if I can make that one bigger because I can't read the rest of the question. To just drop tables. Yes and no. The problem you have with just dropping tables is that if you are an admin, you are able to drop tables, and if you're not an admin, there are a lot of things that you can't do on the system. So one approach is not giving the junior DBA access to your production systems and making changes in production something that is only done via process. Pinterest, yes, absolutely. Questions are answered. How was it with governance risk while migrating your environments from on-prem to cloud? That is absolutely something to bring up with your compliance people. So from a practical perspective, I have clients that are in almost identical businesses where their governance, risk, and compliance officers are all saying different things. And as a result, I ask the compliance, risk, and governance folks what their requirements are. I make a list. I build a solution to satisfy everybody. I ask all three of them to sign off of it, and then I build it. Is it easier on the cloud? Not necessarily, because a little bit less control there, and sometimes the governance, risk, and compliance people are asking for reports that you simply can't get from your cloud-based system. So what ends up happening in real life is that the requirements change. It tends not to be more or less easy, but there is part of a transition there, and that should be part of your testing. How to document for internal purposes and insurance requirements. I think that's a follow-up on the DRP with migrating to the cloud. I think that needs to be more of a conversation. Diana, if you'd like to follow up with a conversation later today or tomorrow, very happy to go through that with you. These could be a whole presentation all by itself, and I'd rather answer your specific questions. I see some thank you messages, and I see excellent, so thank you very much. I think I've got all the questions. If I missed one, somebody please type in, hey, you missed mine. I sent it at a particular time, and I'll be very happy to go back. But aside from,
I think you got them all.
can I play tennis
I
this
do have security around SQL Server. Sanjeev, reach out to us to talk about that specifically. I don't think we're covering that in depth on this series.
Yeah, this series is more of a C-level series, and we do have a lot of technical presentations out on our YouTube site, and Devin can steer you there.
Absolutely. So before you all leave, I do have one last question to do a giveaway with. Jean-Pierre and Sanjeev, you guys have already won, so you're out on this one. So this next question, please type it into chat. There is a correct answer. And the question is, will you be attending the next part in this webinar series? Yes or no? Yes, Joseph Ortiz will be attending. He is the first responder, so he will also get a gift card. So Jean-Pierre, Sanjeev, and Joseph, please email me. I typed my email into the chat with your mailing address, and we'll get you your Amazon gift cards soon. And for everybody else, remember that if you attend all 3 sessions, you get a 4-night, you registered to win a 4-night stay in Blue Ridge, Georgia. It's beautiful. You want to go there, and you get 2 more amazing sessions out of it too. So thank you very much for attending, everybody. Thank you for all the great questions. It's the most questions we've ever had, and that's really cool. So thank you very much, and we'll see you guys in about a month, last Thursday of every month for the next 2 months. Don't forget, and we'll see you then.
Thank you all.